The Olympics, a glorified international competition which promises great gifts for all countries involved. However, below the surface lies deceiving greed and the aggravation of relations between populations of the countries which take part. The principal framework on our side of the house will be as follows. The suffering of countless of countries and their citizens and athletes creates a greater harm than the entertainment value which the Olympics can provide. We will win this debate by proving that the cost incurred by countries involved in the Olympics is simply too great for the minor benefits which it brings to the perceptions from its international audience. As the first speaker, I'll be talking about the economic effects on hosting countries and as well as the aggravating tensions between countries, with my second speaker talking about the damage to the well-being of athletes. Now, beginning with the economic harms. So upon countries' attainment of title as the hosting country, they are promised massive economic benefits. So therefore, countries work to construct a desirable perception in the eyes of the Olympic Committee in order to prove that they are worthy of hosting the Games themselves. So I've got one key mechanism, which is why this is of harm to the countries. That being their over-promising. So these countries will exaggerate what they can achieve in terms of accommodating for the Games. When the time comes for the Games itself, these countries are then left scrambling to develop the infrastructure so as to appear as a favourable host to those in attendance, to the committee, and of course to the athletes themselves. So this places major pressure on the finances of these countries, right? Like this extended period of time over which the country is completely focused on facilitating for these games, which have promised are going to be so grand to the Olympic Committee in order to bring all these economic benefits which they've been promised from the start. And then this results in them pouring in huge amounts of government expenditure into the games, potentially generating debt, and then systems developed for the welfare of their very own country are then left unattended. That namely being healthcare, education, again, all for this promise of economic benefits to their country, to their economy, and to all their citizens. And that brings me nicely to this next aspect of this point, being the falsehood of the promises around hosting the Olympics after being elected as the hosting country. So the attraction to host the Olympic Games, which the committee relies upon, is to bolster the economy of a particular country. And as I said, the financial resources of countries of particular countries have been poured into proving that they are desirable and then executing accordingly. And then, this is all aside from the actual hosting of the games themselves, right? You've been told that you're going to host it, you've tried to execute on your promises, and now you've actually got to host the damn games. And that is where it becomes an even bigger issue, right? Because this is the second round of just dumping finances into this grand event which you've promised for so many years. And the countries must spend even more money on the actual hosting now. And they must develop adequate venues, accommodation, both the athletes and now for this big influx of tourists as well. And countries are prepared again to pay for all of this due to the promise of economic benefits which come along with hosting. For example, that includes Brazil's choice to host the Olympic Games so as to bolster their own economy. Well, what's our issue with this? The development of infrastructure needed to hold the Olympics are of no benefit to the countries once the games are finished. So we accept, for example, pools are needed for swimming, right? For your swimming events, but in the Olympics. But a multi-million dollar aquatics complex is going to be of no economic benefit whatsoever to the country following their hosting, right? That is hardly a profitable economic trade-off, pouring millions into a complex which facilitates all these demanding needs which the country has promised and which the Olympic Games like demand, and like now they're left spending all of this with no return. So that means like governments have spent huge amounts of like money on this infrastructure, which is of no benefit afterward. And then again, I bring you back to like the images of like pool complexes left abandoned in Brazil following their hosting of the games themselves, right? Like pouring huge amounts of money in, like and in fact, like Brazil was an exceptional case in that it allowed like the funneling of finances like between government officials. Like government officials said, yeah, great, let's host these games, and then contracted their mates to be the contractors, to be the builders, and then all of a sudden these people have got rich, and then like that's all at the cost of the population themselves. So even if like countries are like left free of debt, they have spent huge amounts of money which could have been used on the welfare of their own citizens. And like also like economies like the economic benefits of hosting the Olympics are only very short term, right? Like that is the nature of the Olympics themselves. They're a limited time event. That's what generates all like the hype and excitement around them, is that it's like a one-off event that happens like every so often. And with this, it's like a very short time in terms of the economic benefits, right? Like you've got the sudden influx of tourists, which like the country spend years and years preparing for, which is exactly that. And it's just a short-term influx which provides no long-term economic stability, right? Like the negating team could come up here and like suggest that it may make the country appear like more interesting to like these tourists like in attendance and to the Western world as a whole, and like to the world as a whole, which they try to prove themselves to over and over again throughout the process. But that is like there's no tangible economic like benefits, trade-offs to the millions and millions of dollars which is spent on hosting like the prestigious Olympic Games. All of this shows how a false perception is generated around hosting the Olympic Games to the complete and utter detriment of the economy of the countries. And that brings me to another point which I'd like to quickly highlight. That being the nature of Olympics and aggravating tensions between different countries, right? For this we really have to look back and see like what are the Olympics all about, right? They're a scene of immense competition, right? They're the pinnacle of competition between countries. Like countries put forward their very best athletes to compete with each other head to head. Like this results in the development of intense rivalries between countries, and like that's what provides this massive like competition, entertainment value which everyone wants to like tune into and enjoy on the outside world. But what this really allows for is just another outlet of like hate between other countries, right? Like another dividing factor. Like again, I bring in Brazil. Like the rivalry develops between Brazil and like Argentina through football and the Olympics, right? Like this has created a long history of like lasting bitterness between the two countries, right? Like immense division, like over a particular sport, which at times has even got violent, right? And like what does this mean? Well, it means that like the competition which is so appealing to these like to the audiences at home have got like a particular cost. Like there's a flip side to everything which you're seeing in those Olympics. It's like a major cost to the countries, all to provide the entertainment which we all so badly need, right? And like all of this just sours the relations between populations of each of the countries. Relations are like strained in other aspects of contact then between like these countries, right? You've got like bitterness generated between the populations of the two countries. Then you've got like effects on like the diplomatic aspects of it, like trade and all that between the two different like countries, and then like these particular countries are left disadvantaged. So all in all, the competition which is like generated between countries are of no like valuable benefit, no tangible benefit to them whatsoever, much like the economic outcome was just so that we, as the Western world, as the outside world, can sit back and say, wow, that was just so grand. Very proud to affirm.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and I welcome up the first speaker from the gating team to open the team's case.
The Olympics is about more than just sport. It's a spectacle of human nature, And not only that, when you watch that opening ceremony, you see the unification of all these countries coming together to compete with each other. We think that if we remove this, the affirmative side of the House destroys this competitive 2,000-year-old heritage that comes along with it. 4 things that we're going to talk to you about today. I'm firstly going to tell you about what we stand for. Secondly, about the importance for athletes of these games. Thirdly, about the importance for the global community and how it ruins sporting engagement. And fourthly, about how there is an economic benefit. But before I go on, I'm going to just give a couple quick pieces of rebuttal. I have more material on this as my 4th point, but we heard about this idea of host countries being lured in, and that the economic benefits are false. Before we go any further, AF really needs to outline A, why these economic promises, such as potential tourism benefits, don't actually exist, and I'm going to outline why instead they do exist, but also why countries can't reasonably make a decision about their financial state currently, and why they're just going to deliberately put themselves into a financial hole.
Point.
Secondly, on the idea of aggravating tensions, 2 things. Firstly, we believe that the Olympics is unifying, right? It's the idea of everybody coming together, and we think that it's quite a good global image, and people see that. But secondly, I don't think they've considered the alternative. The alternative is that we have individual sports still competing as individual tournaments, but we have these rivalries still existing, so those tensions don't actually go away on their side of the house. Okay, on to my first point. What do we stand for? Well, we stand for the Olympics with one significant change, and that's it. We have stronger regulations on who the IOC allows for actually hosting it. We do not want the IOC giving it to nations that have committed human rights violations, nations that clearly have no financial capacity to do it, nations that are not fit to suit. And we think that means that we are going to have appropriate host nations. On to our second point. What is the importance of the Olympics for the athletes? Consider that these athletes have spent their entire lives working towards this, spent their entire lives being able to perform on the global stage to an audience of around 2 billion people, knowing that that is something that they can achieve. What impact does removing the Olympics have? Well, firstly, the athletes now are probably crushed, right? What we've done is we've just negated their entire life passion, because we're removing their opportunity to show their ability, to represent their country, their family on the world stage, let their name be known and put down in the history books alongside other people on the gold medal list. But if we think about it also from a financial perspective, when you're not able to put yourself on that world television, you're not going to get those sponsorships anymore. You're only going to become this lesser known name that isn't going to be able to earn as much money as an Olympic athlete can, such as Usain Bolt. This is so important because we're actually destroying the lives of athletes now, but we also have impact on athletes going forward into the future. Consider that we ruin the motivation for people to compete in the Olympics or these types of events further on if we get rid of them, because we have 3 reasons for this. Firstly is that we have people no longer being seen on the world stage. We think that egos actually do drive quite a lot of sports performance. People want to be known. Secondly, though, as we've already talked about, you do lose that financial incentive. If you can no longer see a reasonable career where you have 8 years of your pinnacle sporting career and you can't earn enough money in that time to be able to become a self-sufficient, somebody who can feed your family, then you're probably less likely to follow it. But we think also that sports probably lose a bit of prestige, right? If you're in something such as trap shooting, a sport that's probably not going to be watched as an individual thing, you don't get that same platform that the Olympic provides for you to be considered alongside the likes of people such as David Beckham in football, or these really high and powerful people such as Usain Bolt. You're being put on the same platform. If you get a gold medal, it does not mean less than these other people. The affirmative side of the House doesn't want to protect athletes, and as I'll talk about now, it actually leads to a degradation in the quality of sport overall. But before I go forward, I'll take a POI.
What is to stop countries which the IOC is evaluating from presenting an image more noble than they can actually manage?
2 things. Firstly, realistically, we think that global perception is somewhat reasonable. We can tell if there's human rights violations going on in a country. We can tell if a country has a poor economic situation. If we're able to tell that Brazil isn't fit to host it, then I think the IOC, who have professional analysts, can probably do the same. Anyway, how does AF ruin sporting engagement? Consider that people don't actually tune into the Olympics necessarily for the sport. They actually tune into it more for a spectacle. So if we consider that the London opening ceremony in 2012 had 2 billion people watching it and is the second most watched event in all of TV history, people are not tuning in because of the sport, because of the athletes necessarily. They're tuning in because of the 2,000 years of prestigious history behind it, the narratives that go behind, and this idea of this being the platform where peak human performance is shown. What happens if we break this? Well, firstly is that we simply lose 2 billion people watching sport, right? They're probably not all going to go over to other individual sports because there isn't that same idea of it being the Olympics. It doesn't have that same weight going and watching the table tennis national champions. But we also think that sports probably loses a bit of significance along with it because that highest level of platform is being removed because we think that if the Olympics is always we've been held up to be the highest standard of performance and we get rid of it, then there isn't that standard where people can measure what the top level looks like. Why does it matter that we have sports engagement? This is pretty simple. It gives people role models, but it's also a show of unity, right? That we can all compete with each other at the end of the day. Now on to the fourth and final point. How does AF actually remove huge tourism and economic benefits to the global community? We have 5 reasons, or to the hosting community, 5 reasons. Okay, firstly, people come from all around the globe to go to these events. We think that you're probably talking about near millions of people who will be willing to travel to London to watch the Olympics, to see that opening ceremony, to see the spectacle, and you're losing out on all that potential benefit from the affirmative side of the house. But consider also the second thing is that there's actually a lot of jobs required in building a stadium. They don't just pop out of nowhere. You've got to pay for these people. These people are getting employment out of it. These people may not be able to get it otherwise. We have builders that are now able to feed their family on our side of the house. Thirdly, is we're probably going to get more investment into cities. Businesses are going to probably put money into hotels, for example, things that are more tangible than stuff like as stocks, and actually have benefits to people in the real world. They have people who are being used to employ to build them. They have people working in the hotels that they are investing into. And if we're putting these resources, then these nations do benefit from it. Fourthly is exposure. We think that there is massive benefit in having the London Eye rotating, all very pretty, on the world news, going to 2 billion different people, them all able to see how cool, how good, how impressive London is as a place. We think this encourages people, not only now, as the affirmative side of the house would want you to believe, but also into the next years coming on, to come to London and visit it as a city, not just for the Olympics. Fifthly, is we also think that heritage of the Olympics encourages people to go back to different sites. We think if you have Olympic museums or stuff, there's benefit and people will be willing to pay to go and see these things into the future. 30 years from now, there will be people who want to go see the exact place where Usain Bolt broke the world record. They will pay good money to see that. They will pay to be toured around. Lastly, is that we consider that these smaller tournaments, which is the alternative, will never be as economically as successful. They will never have the same viewership. They will never have the same platform. They will never be as important as the Olympics. Outside of the house helps the host nations. We make the athletes be able to perform, show off to their families, show off to their countries, and that is so important. Proud to stand.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the second affirmative speaker to continue the case for Northland.
What the negating team conveniently left out today was the comparative, right? Because they painted this lovely image of when we're building massive stadiums that are only used for a couple of weeks for the Olympics, that builders are employed. But where's the money going on outside of the house, right? Because instead of billions being funneled into these schemes of friends and relatives and all this corrupt system they have on their side of the house, this money is actually instead put into building infrastructure that actually helps the country in the long term. Building schools, building hospitals, putting these funds towards things that not only provide employment for the construction workers that they were talking about, but actually improve and develop the countries for decades to come, instead of a transient tourist boom that they basically leave countries stranded with afterwards. 3 main points of clash for you today. Firstly, who gets better economic development on either side of the house? Secondly, quickly, a point on nationalism. And then thirdly, on kind of the value and impact on sport as a whole. Followed by kind of integrated rebuttal and how their side of the house damages the well-being of athletes. So on this first one in clash on economic growth, right? They basically told us that they can easily just curtail the ability of hosting in developing countries and countries that maybe not be the best set up for it. Why will this not happen? There are many reasons for this. First of all, we see that developing countries are pressured into over-promising to Olympic committees. Why does this happen? Three main reasons. Firstly, politicians are literally assailed and lobbied from all angles, from all sides, by corporate contractors to promise more and more because they have a vested interest in being able to build these facilities and actually gaining profit from when the government contracts all these companies to build the facilities. Secondly, we see that actually outright bribery and corruption very commonly happens. We saw that in Brazil, for example, politicians advocated extravagant facilities and then contracted the companies of their friends and relatives to build them, literally paying government money that needs to go to homeless families and starving children, instead going towards their close circles through the Olympics, which is basically a massive Ponzi scheme on their side of the house. Thirdly, we see that politicians in the global south, and even in countries like America and across the world, are often forced into short-termist mindsets by the instability of elected governments and the pressures on them, right? Because if they're given the opportunity to make big promises of jobs and growth to the local electorate, they're likely going to pursue that short-term electoral win over, decades-long concerns of where money's allocated, which will help best develop the country in the long term. Secondly, what do we see as a result of all this over-promising that I've just proved happens on their side of the house? Well, first of all, it's a massive debt trap, right? Because they must borrow money and take out loans from organizations like the World Bank, organizations like the IMF, right? And what does this debt trap do? It's a terrible flow-on effect for these countries. Because instead of this infrastructure actually lifting these countries out of poverty and lifting them towards development, it traps them in perpetually paying higher and higher interest, losing out on all this investment that could have gone towards social services, that could have gone towards uplifting people that desperately need it. So we see that at the end of this, even if countries were not to do all this, and they're not to borrow this money, and they stayed within their own means, which I proved will not happen, we refuse to stand for the drastic harms of meeting the Olympic standards, right? Because even if maybe they have a slightly less extravagant facility, it's still going to be billions of dollars, and we would much prefer the comparative, where that money goes towards schools, where that money goes towards hospitals, or even just plain infrastructure, like building better buildings, building new roads, all these things like sewage that helps society in a very practical way that they do not get on their side of the house because they're funneling billions towards the Olympic Games. So what do we see at the end of this? We see that ultimately we see developing countries spending billions of dollars on facilities that do next to nothing for their own people, all to look aesthetically pretty to Western viewers and provide basically a good location for corporate advertisement to rest on. So what does this bring us? So they basically told us they're going to get really good infrastructure and tourism on their side of the house, right? They told us builders employed. We told you that's not going to be a stable job. We much prefer it happening elsewhere. But also, we much prefer they talked about tourism being produced by the Olympics. But what do we say in response to that? We say that it's dangerously transient, right? Because it does not support long-term markets. People literally come, as they said, as sports fans. People come because they're interested in sports, not because they're desperately wanting to travel around Brazil and see what Brazil's like, not because they're wanting to, experience Indian culture primarily. The primary factor, as they literally said at first, is because they're fans of the sports, right? So when the sport literally leaves this country, they're no longer going to come back, It's not going to create this long-lasting market as they'd have you believe. And this is literally why Brazil's government concluded afterwards, after government analysis, that it literally provided less revenue than the money they spent into the Olympics at the end of this. It's massively destructive to not only developing countries, but even to countries, to cities like Los Angeles that suffer massively with homelessness, with poverty. This is what the legacy they give on their side of the house at the end of this point. Moving on to nationalism, right? They gave us this pretty ridiculous idea that it's going to bring countries together by competition, right? It just asserted over and over that competition is somehow a uniting factor. We say the opposite is actually true, and for countries with deep divides, competition does nothing but exacerbate that. But we say that even if it does successfully unite people inside nations, we say it is not worth this at the cost of inflaming xenophobic hate and literally sharpening conflicts between different countries, right? Because while we see that Indian participation in the Olympics has done literally nothing to bridge the Hindu-Muslim divide inside the country, it has certainly been a flashpoint for nationalist, racist slurs literally weaponized by audiences in a hockey match between India and Pakistani teams, right? We see that's the comparative on their side of the house today. Not only do they fail to actually get unity within countries, but they inflame hatreds and tensions outside between countries. I'll take a few on now.
Can you please explain why this doesn't exist on your side of the house?
First of all, as I'm about to go into right now, is that the Olympics is uniquely a national scape, right? You're representing your entire country. It's literally, as you said, pitting countries to compete against each other. That is very unique to the Olympics, and there is no other event, as you literally said at first, that is at that high scale and that focused on nationalism and on representing national countries. Okay, moving on to my next one, Flash, on kind of the value of sport. So they told us we're basically going to lose people's passions, right? First of all, what do we say that for audiences watching this, when Olympics is gone, they're still able to participate in local sports, they're still able to pursue sports teams they liked. But we'd actually prefer that to happen. We don't think a person that coaches their son's football team is suddenly going to quit because the Olympics no longer happens. We are very happy for things to become actually more localized and out of the house. But secondly, as I'm going to go into, we actually get an improved field of sport as a whole because it's far less commercialized, it's far less puppeteered by all these, vulturistic companies that are just trying to take over sport and basically corrupt it for their own ends. I'll go into that in my split point. But also we'd say that we don't actually support the horrific human costs that come to the individual athletes because of the Olympics, which also I'm addressing in my split point. Now, what did they basically tell us in response to this, right? They said it negated their entire life's passion. Absolutely incorrect, right? Because when you go into sports, when you live in poverty and you try every day, you spend your time, instead of doing other things, you go and play football, you go and try running, practice super hard. That's your passion because you enjoy it and because you find inspiration from it. And it doesn't matter whether you get $1 million or $10 million profits off that, you're equally incentivized to go into that as your field, right? Because the difference they say today is that, oh no, Usain Bolt isn't going to have, $100 million. He'll probably only have $10 million or $5 million. We say the incentives are basically the same on either side of the house, right? You're still able to attain things like national fame, but you're not put on this level that they said on the Olympics. And we're actually very happy for less pressure to be placed on these athletes because it can actually ruin their lives. Because, right, it's very important to note that this Usain Bolt example they gave only applies to a select few, a very tiny minority of the actual athletes. The majority fail to actually make it to the Olympics, but are still subject to all these pressures and horrible abuses that they have on their side of the house. And that brings me to my split. How do they damage the well-being of athletes? Two main mechanisms. Firstly, because the Olympics is uniquely concerned with representing entire nations on a worldwide scale, there's an immense amount of pressure placed on athletes to be as competitive as possible. This is why Russian athletes were pressured to take performance-enhancing drugs developed by literal government scientists at risk to their own health and careers. The compulsion of nationalism and historic international publicity that's specifically particular to the Olympics actually cost those athletes their livelihoods, right? But secondly, we say by virtue of representing nations at the world level, the Olympics is massively attractive to corporations, and these corporations have no regard for the health and mental well-being of athletes, and they're entirely motivated by maximizing profit. For example, we saw young girls enveloped in training for representing the US in track at the Olympics were forced to run perpetually by their Adidas sponsorship teams to the detriment of their own health, right? To the point that one of the girls' puberty was literally disrupted, she no longer had periods, she had long-term bone effects and loss of growth, all of this adding to psychological trauma at the end of her life, and she didn't even make it to the Olympics, right? This is the terrible commercialization they provide on their side of the house by having this national scale Olympics. We are very happy to defend athletes on our side of the house and actually defend developing countries from the vulturistic ruptures of all these rich corporations. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the second speaker from the negating team to continue the case for Otago-Southland.
It's really interesting that I've wanted to come out and bring a whole lot of points about how there's this immense pressure on athletes to perform well in the Olympics, when it's literally the same amount of pressure that you would see when they perform at any other sort of World Cup equivalent that is going to have to be instituted under their side of the model to actually provide any sort of benefit to these athletes who are still able to perform in their field. All this sort of pressure that any 12-year-old feels at a track meet, because we think that these are trained athletes who are taught explicitly how to stay calm under pressure. And who are really trained how to deal with this own health. Anyway, right. Four clashes today first for you. Firstly, who gets better economic impacts? Secondly, how does this impact the global community? Thirdly, impacts on athletes. And then fourthly, I'll bring a bit of an extension and split about how the Olympic has exclusive power to bring about political change. Right. Who gets better economic impacts on each side of the house? What we heard from Side F was that there was that countries were falling victim to overpromise, right? And they were, as a result, making bad decisions. We told you really, really clearly at Caleb, but it actually hasn't been responded to once, that we were able to, that under our model, we were told you we were going to stand by not allowing countries in literal economic malaise to host, right? This means, as a result, we don't get countries in literal economic malaise hosting the Olympics. This is the sort of people that they wanted to, stop from being harmed under their side of the house. We tell you that they're not actually getting harmed under our side of the house either. Secondly, though, we tell you that no country is actually ever forced to host the Olympics. We tell you actually that they spend a considerable amount of time putting together a bid for a toss-up that is incredibly competitive. It means that they have to be really, really confident that they can get their money back, because they have to spend so much time and thought in this bid, because they have to make it seem really appealing just because of how competitive this bid actually is. And it means that they have to therefore they've had to therefore like go through the process to like check that this is like a really beneficial thing for them. As a result, we think given all the time that they're going to spend going through it, they're never going to like make a bad decision. They're never going to like not look at the economic side of it, right? This was a really, really stupid mechanism. No. Thirdly, though, we told you all of the incredible benefits we get to tourism, right? They told you this sort of mechanism about how, like, even if we do get benefits, it's only short term. Completely, again, ignoring all of Caleb's material about how, like, you know, when people see, like, a really beautiful beach in Brazil, and during the opening ceremony, they're always going to, like, look back at that and really, like, want to go there. We also told you about how people like just want to go for like the sentimental value of it because it's like a really historical point, right? This was also completely ignored by Side F. But like more importantly, we told you in the short term, we're literally getting millions of tourists coming to these areas and like checking into the hotels or like buying food at local restaurants and really boosting the economy that way. This is so, so important, a completely mutually exclusive benefit we get from the Olympics under our side of the house. We also told you that we get all of these sort of jobs and just this extreme sort of money. Really important to note here that even so far as they could prove that like they want to benefit the schools anyway, we tell you really clearly that we get a full return on this money anyway. We've told you this, mechanised this really clearly at Caleb, but we actually tell you we probably get not only the full return, but we actually get more as well. And this means that like as a result, we're able to get this continuous benefits and put this extra money that we get back, and that's going to like not only that's actually going to like be a continuous benefit because we tell you we're going to continually get this sort of economic return that can go back into helping like those schools and hospitals that they told you that they cared so much about. We get this on our side of the house anyway. Right. Secondly now, how does this impact the global community? We heard this point about how like rivalry was going to be so fierce, it was going to like destroy the relationship between Brazil and Argentina. We actually point out a few responses to this. Firstly, that like everyone actually just really enjoys sports. It's actually something that people really enjoy. Like this is a sort of rivalry that they really, really love. They thrive on it because they like look forward to watching this football game. That's like the highlight of their week because they get to like see the country they're really, really competitive against. Like this is something they like just look forward to. It's really, really positive for you. Secondly, though, it doesn't actually change under their side of the house anyway, because like even if they're not competing against each other in the Olympics, they're going to be competing against each other at like the football World Cup or like literally any other sort of sports competition and any other sport, right? So they didn't actually tell you how this changes. They just pointed out that it was a harm. We tell you that not only is it a benefit, but we actually get a couple more benefits from like to the global community because we actually just get like a general level of enjoyment for everyone, completely mutually exclusive to our side of the house because we tell you the Olympics is just like this incredibly enjoyable event for so many people because it's like, you know, like it's what co-workers get to talk about at the water cooler together, right? Oh, like it just brings people, like it brings random people together who are now like screaming side by side, and they're now cheering and backing the same people. It's just really, really entertaining for you. We also tell you that it's like really uniting on a global scale because it just means it's just like a really good show of humanity, right? Because every country is just boiling down to having the sort of just having the same sort of like citizens who just love sport and just like want to run a race, right? Yeah, I'll take your pen right now.
Yeah, if athletes perform to a high enough level that makes their removal from the of the Olympics unjust, wouldn't they be able to generate recognition and income and privately run competitions uniquely catered to their chosen field?
No, because the only sort of sports that the F has actually brought up are like ones that probably get covered anyway. We bring to you things examples like, I don't know, table tennis players or people who go to the Olympics, and this is like the peak of their career, right? This is the only sort of coverage that they get, and it's really, really important that they are able to get that recognition on the same level as like a sprinter or something like that, right? These people are literally going to have no other opportunity. We told you this really, really clearly at Caleb because, like, the nature of those sports is like the Olympics is like the top thing for them. That's what they aspire to do. And we think they're never able to like get this sort of thing at any other point. Moving now on to like impacts on athletes, right? We heard the sort of like response that like a coach was never going to like disengage with the sport just because he couldn't watch the Olympics. Not sufficient enough. Here's a few reasons why. So what we heard, So what we heard majorly was just like there was this immense pressure on athletes to like perform really well. We tell you clearly that this exists anyway. If not at the Olympics, it'll just be at like the other sports, cup or whatever it is that they like substitute and attend anyway. They're never actually getting rid of this pressure regardless. Secondly, we tell you like these athletes have been trained from like the very, very base level of like how to stay calm, right? That's like what a lot of their coaching is. That's a lot of it like is mental things anyway. And therefore, it means that they're like going to like be like really, really well equipped to like deal with this sort of pressure anyway. We also tell you, what was more important though is that like these are the athletes actually get to make this choice as to whether they compete, right? They get to like choose whether this is like the thing that they want to go into, and they choose whether this to like show up to trainings all of these years. It means that like what it does mean is that all of these athletes feel like this is their one opportunity to compete on a global level and get recognition and perform really, really well. This is something that F is like taking away from them. They're no longer having this platform, this thing to aspire to that they've worked so hard for so long. That is an incredible harm on their side of the house. Really quickly now, a bit of an extension is to the Olympics' exclusive power to get political change. The Olympics has an incredible amount of power to pressure countries into fixing wrongdoings. Why? Because countries really want their athletes to like compete, because it's a chance for them to do really well, for them to like look good on a global level. It's because like New Zealand wants everyone to see how good they are at rugby sevens, right? It means that their countries are also really, really happy when they get to see their citizens compete on the TV. Massive benefits here, just like happy people such that who have like things to look forward to. Secondly, because it means like when these countries are like banned from the Olympics, it's like showing that they're being globally condemned. We get exposure against really, really harmful countries. We get far more awareness and political pressure on democracies to put tariffs, etc. on these countries. This is really important because when AF takes this away, they actually lose an extreme mechanism for the West to get human rights for vulnerable people. It looks like, we could literally ban China from the Olympics or revoke their rights to host unless they take away the action to fix their literal genocide. And it's abhorrent that AF wants to take away this really, really powerful mechanism and critically hard to stand.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and to conclude the substantive portion of the affirmative block, I invite up the third affirmative speaker.
The moment the negative team came out here today, and they said in 50 years somebody's going to go to Brazil because they want to see where Usain Bolt won the Olympics. That is where they had an unrealistic view. That is when they didn't realise why people go to places. It's not, they don't go to Brazil to see a beach they saw in the opening ceremony. They go to Brazil because they want to see the country, not because they saw it like on the Olympic opening ceremony. So 3 main points of clash in today's debate. The first one being about the economic and societal factors. The second one being about the nationalism that the Olympics brings. And the third one is sort of like the effect on like athletes themselves. Now for my first point of clash, which is about economic and societal factors. So what have we heard from the gay team today? You know, they talked about how like tourists will like come over to the Brazil and sort of like boost the economy and sort of make really good long-term changes. That's where they sort of failed, because they failed to sort of think about how this won't be long-term and how this will actually only be short-term. Now, why will this be short-term? Because the Olympics is like a 2-month games, you know, it's not for like 50 years, it's only going to be 2 weeks. You know, you've got a job for like 2 weeks, they say, hey, we need people to work in my accommodation for 2 months. They work in the accommodation, after the Olympics Games is over, there's no more people coming into the country, so they can't actually support their job. So it's not like these jobs are going to be long here for like ever and ever, because as soon as the Olympics Games is over, it's not like there's any incentive to keep these people here. You know, this like job isn't going to decide whether someone gets to eat off dinner. You know, you don't have a job for 10 years. You have it for 2 months while the Olympics Games is on, and once the Olympic Games is off, you sort of lose it because there's no sort of long-term effects that the Olympic Games bring. You know, they talked about how you could like build more accommodation, and this would sort of like give people jobs. But we believe this is actually a false sense of job security. Like when you tell people, hey, here's a job. You know, have a job. You know, work in our accommodation. You know, they get fired after a month, like after the Olympics Games is over. This creates a false sense of job security. You know, they get fired straight away. It's sort of like a short-term effect. It's not a long-term that they've tried to build on. You know, they brought up this idea about like building infrastructure and that would be sort of there for like forever. You know, yes, there may be like more facilities, but the problem is that one, like the infrastructure is like normally unneeded. Like as my first speaker brought up, like pools in Brazil, you know, they're needed for 2 weeks and they're just like gone. You know, that nobody ever really uses them again. The second response is that these facilities like are built for short-term purposes, they're not for long-term. You know, look at these Brazil. This again, Brazil keeps coming up. But like if we look at Brazil and the pool, you know, the building started eroding like a year after it was built because they're built for short-term. They're built to look good on camera. They're not like built to look good for society and be there for long-term. And thirdly is that the people who pay for these facilities is often governments. You know, they're trying to build and try to keep to this like immense pressure that the Olympics is giving to them. I'll touch on that later. But they often waste billions of dollars on useless things that could be used somewhere else. You know, they don't need a pool for their society. They don't need a pool. It won't bring them big economic like benefits, because there is no long-term economical benefits, as we've proven down the line. You know, they can spend this money that they're spending on the pool to try look good on like homelessness, education. Now, why should they do this? Why do they like build these different things? Well, firstly, like they want to look good on a global stage. Like when they're at the Olympics, they want to be like the biggest swimming pool, like the biggest stadium. And secondly, they're promised like economic benefit that never really comes. Like if we look at Brazil, they have no long-term benefits that's still there from the games in 2004. They have no long-term effects that's still helping them today. You know, they talked about like stronger regulations on host countries and how like they would sort of control under their model. But like countries often give like a false image to get Olympics into their countries, to get this so-called like economic that comes with it, which is sort of like a false sense. You know, as Ronan and Nick have sort of both told you down the line, is that they often portray like a false sense. Like they say, hey, we've got heaps of stuff, and then they build them really quick and they pass it on to their friends who get rich and sort of exploiting government money. You know, we don't, like, they talked about this idea, like, we can sort of find human rights in countries and we won't put human rights in that countries. Well, firstly, we just don't believe that's true. You know, throughout history, we can see that it's pretty obvious how countries can, like, hide it and sort of, like, put it under the rug and sort of make people not see human rights. So for that idea about we would restrict it to, like, good countries, it's completely wrong, because they don't have, like, the things to do that, you know. So why does, like, they talked about this idea about how it won't sort of affect, like, world, like, first-class countries, and it will only affect, like, second-class countries. But why will it affect first-class countries too? Two responses. The first one is that they often have, like, inadequate, like, places/facilities. Like, they have to pay billions of dollars to upgrade their swimming pool to make it to, like, Olympic quality. They've got to make it, like, a massive running stadium. So often this means that, like, even first-class countries are spending billions of dollars to try and get their pools and like fields to the best standards. And secondly, they often try and hide the problem just for that 2 months. Like if we look at Brazil and the USA, what they do is they actually put like homeless people in shelters for those 2 months. So it makes their countries look really good on a national stage and gives them like this false perception of like being a good sort of like clean country. Now for the second point of clash, which is about this nationalism effect, you know, they've talked about how like the Olympic Games makes us all like have the same goal, makes us all come together. But the thing is, that is literally literally proving our own point. Because what happens when you bring a country together in the Olympic Games is that the sole purpose for this is to beat other country, to be better than the other country. You know, this is different to other sports like football, because this is on a national level. Governments are sort of supporting this because they want to look the best. You know, in football, we don't have governments supporting it, we have clubs. But this is governments, this is like the country on a national stage. That's what the difference is. And that's why this is often a lot bigger than like other sort of sports, you know. Often you hear like countries sort of nailing another country, like saying either rude or racist, like trying to demonise and belittle another country. So this sort of like unifies everyone to sort of crap on another person, so it sort of like passes that on. So we don't believe that is actually a very good benefit at all. And secondly, like as I've said before, the difference between this and football is that this is on a national stage. You know, they're representing their governments, and that's, as Ronan brought up, like that's why the Russian athletes were forced to take drugs in the Olympics a couple of years ago, because there's so much pressure from the governments, which brings me nicely on to my third point of clash, which is about the effect on the actual athletes themselves. So they've brought out this really different point about how like they spent their whole life training to sort of be like an athlete. Well, my first two responses to this, the first one being that like when you go into sport, you go into it because you like it. Like most people don't be like, hey, I can get billions of dollars from football, so let's go into football. You know, they play football because they think, hey, I like football, I want to play on the weekend. You know, often this is just because they realise they're actually quite good at it. You know, under our side of the house, they'll still be able to play these sports. They might not just be able to get $1 million, they might be able to get $1 million, because they can still do it on like a national stage, but just not so big that it sort of demonises other people. You know, and secondly, if we look at how like these athletes are actually being treated, like often these athletes are being put in horrendous situations. As Ronan told you before, like this girl who was like representing America, and how like she was forced to like run so much, and she was going through so many traumatic effects that this really damaged her psychologically and mentally. And she even came out afterwards and she said she would never do it if she came back into like if she had the chance to come again. You know, they brought up this idea that like sports will suddenly lose prestige, but the thing is that there will still be so many sports. You know, there'll still be your football on Saturday, there'll still be your rugby on Sunday night. You know, we don't believe that the Olympics opening ceremony changes that sports will be so prestigious. You know, we believe that these national events that sort of bring people together, like the football, like the league and stuff, will still be there, and it will still be able to like help like sports in general. You know, they talked about this idea of people losing passion like with their sports. Two responses to this. The first one, that like we don't believe that they'll completely lose their passion. Why not? Because there's huge pressure that the Olympics brings. You know, Olympics brings so much pressure to these athletes. These athletes have to go through tremendous things that traumatizes them just to try and like abide by their government and try and be the best they can and try like be the best in the game, which sort of has detrimental effects, which we've proven down and down the line. So like trying to, and also secondly, is that they often try and be what people want them to be. Like if you look at athletes, they often have so much expectations. You know, they've got to be slim, they've got to be nice, they've got to be non-talkative, they've got to have political views. So that is why we believe the Olympics has a lot more worse effects than better effects, and we believe the move must stand.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech, and to conclude the substantive portion of the debate, I'll invite up the third speaker for the negative team.
As he would have said in any of the POIs that were never accepted, the entire AF team case falls apart when their path to victory is building schools, but they never engage with the fact that we get more money for these countries because of all of the returns on investment. It would be a completely irrational choice for a government which has much more resources than just some high schoolers that can clearly come up with the idea, that it would be completely irrational to fund the Olympics if they did not believe they were going to get an economic benefit from it. Therefore, they've lost this debate because we're the side that actually gets more money that we can then use to build these things. But anyway, they're never going to get this investment for schools in the first place because no World Bank is going to invest in Brazil to build schools. They'll invest in Brazil to have an Olympics, not to build schools. 3 questions to ask yourself. Firstly, what's more important in this debate? Is it the economics and sporting value benefits, or is it the nationalism point? Secondly, which side gets greater sporting value? And then thirdly, which side gets greater economics? Let's have a look at their nationalism point. This completely falls out of the debate when they suddenly try and pretend that the root of nationalism is just sporting conflicts. We don't think that is actually what nationalism is built on. We think nationalism is probably built off of racial and religious divides. But even if we are to buy that nationalism is somehow so impacted by sporting competitions, they still have sporting competitions. They still have the World Cup. They still have all of these other tournaments for these individual sports that they have instead of the Olympics. That still has huge tensions between different countries because it's not the fact that the government sponsors the team. It's the fact that you want to root for your country. It's not that the government was there. It's that you care about you winning. That's the actual type of nationalism tensions. Let's move on to have a look at economics then. What have we heard from AF? Firstly, they've had this ludicrous claim that these governments are just going to act irrationally and are not going to and are going to want to have the Olympics, even if it's not going to get them any money. 2 responses here. Firstly, we think that it might be possible that a government might write a report that was slightly more favourable than it actually would be, but the IOC reviews these reports. That's the point of that organisation. The fact that there's 20 different countries that are bidding for the Olympics means that they and their professional economists get to look through all of them. They get to see, this country that literally didn't have a parliament until 10 years ago seems to think that they're going to be able to build 50 stadiums. Let's have a look and see, is this realistic? If they decide, no, it's not realistic, then they'll probably give the bid to somewhere like the UK, to somewhere that has the infrastructure. If they think that, this developing country actually does have a lot of the resources there because maybe they've already had a past Olympics or something like that, that's when they would decide, let's go here. They're not just going to randomly pick some country that has no actual way of having an economic chance of success from the Olympics. They're going to review these applications. They don't just randomly pick one out of a hat. Secondly then, they told us that these countries are going to exploit government money. We think this falls out of the debate when this probably happens either way. We think that if they have authoritarian governments that are going to exploit this money, that happens regardless of whether there's funding for an Olympics or whether there's just taxpayer money. We think that's completely irrelevant in this debate. Next, they've then told us is that their comparative and their way to win on this economics point is that they are going to build schools. They never explained in any of their speeches how they're ever going to get funding for this. This is so important because we have to look at the two scenarios of countries that would ever hold an Olympics. Firstly, it's developed countries. We don't think their point has any grounds in the debate when developed countries probably already have schools, they already have hospitals, they already have all of these things. If they get more money from our investments, which we do as I'll cover on later, that's great, they can invest more on these schools, but it doesn't particularly matter because that's not how they fund schools. They fund schools through taxpayer money. But then the second category to look at is developing countries. We think that these countries, these are the ones that rely on investment. They're never going to get this investment from like the World Bank, from other huge organisations, because they will only invest in something that looks like they will get their money back, that looks like they'll get a rate of return on it. Building schools in Brazil is never going to have the same appeal to the World Bank to invest in them as opposed to the Olympics. That's why it's so important that countries like this would get the Olympics under our side of the house, because then they get all of this money from tourism where they can actually put it towards building the schools that they care about for so many reasons. Finally, then on economics, they told us that these stadiums are just going to get wasted. We simply reject this. Firstly, they can have other tournaments. The Olympics, quite often, you can go like 20 years in the future and they'll hold the next Olympics. Or, if you've held an Olympics, maybe next you'll hold like the World Swimming Finals. Maybe next you'll hold like a cycling thing. These stadiums get reused and they get more benefits from all of the economic incentives that I'm going to go over again because they clearly never understood why we get so many long-term benefits. That's because when 2 billion people watch the Olympics opening stadium, when they see these beautiful beaches that they have in Brazil, when they see these really cool tourist attractions that they have in London, that is exposure. That is like exposure that you literally can't buy with tourism campaign ads. We think the main reason that people go to a country, as they even admitted, was because you want to go see either cool buildings or cool like natural things. You want to go to a really exciting place. For that to happen, people need to actually know that your place is exciting. That is why the Olympics is so good, because when everybody is watching it, when they're seeing the athletes talk about how much fun they had on their days off, when they got to go explore Rio, when they see all of the wonderful footage of the beautiful beaches, of the beautiful statues they have, that's when you get this huge tourism benefit, and it actually compounds over the long term, because people want to have a look back and see like where their famous sporting heroes competed. Yes, I'll take a POI.
Yeah, so we've been told that there is no pressure for athletes to take part in the Olympics, but that the Olympics are the only way forward for them to gain recognition. What stance is your side of the house taking?
Well, we tell you that there's no pressure for these athletes to compete if they don't want to. If they think it's too stressful, then they don't have to, which ties into my next clash. But if they do want to, then that's the only chance they get. What happens is it's two different people. It's the type of people that don't want to. In both worlds, they don't do it because it's too stressful or something. But for the people that do want to, if they want to actually get success, actually get a benefit from it, then they have to have economic benefits, which we only get because we get huge media attraction, we get huge financial investment incentives, prizes. But on their board, when it's just smaller competitions, like I don't know about you guys, but I'm not going to watch the like world tennis, table tennis championships. I probably would watch the Olympics. What that means is that for that table tennis player, they're going to be seen to, if they get a gold medal in table tennis, they're going to get huge investment opportunities from like Nike or sponsorships, things like that. They don't, because under their world, it's just some niche tournament that only people that are very that care about it specifically watch. But the Olympics, everybody does. It's a global event. For that reason, we've won this debate.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech. As is customary, I'll be reversing the speaking order to invite up the leader of the negative team to conclude today's debate.
Three questions to ask yourself at the end of today's debate. Firstly, who gets better economic benefits for these host countries? Secondly, how does this impact the global community? And thirdly, how does this impact athletes? Jumping straight in then to who gets better economic benefits. We told you really clearly, straight down our line, that we get better economic benefits for three reasons. Firstly, because we have millions of people coming for tourism. Really important to make the comparison here that these are millions of people who just otherwise wouldn't be coming, because onto their side of the house they're standing by just an Olympics not happening, or a sporting games of a far smaller scale that people just are generally disinterested in. The comparison here is that we're having millions of people coming and boosting the economy that otherwise wouldn't come. Secondly, though, because we have jobs that are going to have to build these stadiums or build these hotels and all this necessary infrastructure, we told you really clearly that a stadium that takes 5 years to build, not 2 months the way that they tried to characterise it, are now having so many people coming and building these jobs and having a job. The comparison here is that even so far as it might have been a 2-month project, is that they otherwise don't have a job anyway. So that we think that we're really proud to stand by something giving people a job for even if it is a limited period of time, which we gave you the mechanisms as to why it is probably long term. But we're really happy to give people a job for that period of time, because the comparison is they have nothing. They have people without jobs. Really proud to stand by that. Thirdly, though, because we get these countries exposure that are going to cause people to want to come, right? Because they get to see those beautiful beaches of Brazil, as we talked about. Really important to note here that this is long term, and it's long term that is going to reap a consistent benefit. Also, just a benefit that otherwise wouldn't exist on their side of the house, because really clearly the comparison here is that they just don't get exposure and nobody gets to see the beautiful beaches of Brazil. What it means is that we're able to get the returns that that the host countries put in and into their things, right? We gave you the mechanisms as to why they were able to make a really justified decision as to whether it is economically beneficial for them to do so, and we think that they have every right to therefore go and pursue that. And it means that as a result we're able to spend this money back into everything that AF wanted to care about anyway, right? We're able to go and fund these schools, fund these hospitals, and we're actually able to do this more than they were anyway, so we will win the debate here. They never actually we never actually impact the developing countries the way that we said they would, because we modelled really clearly from our first speaker that developing countries who were not in the position to host would not be hosting, and therefore it means under our side of the house that a little bit of extra cash for the hospitality industry can go a really long way, something we're really proud to stand by. So secondly now, how does this impact the global community? What we heard from F was compared to competition cause this really bad nationalism. We gave you many responses to this, but primarily you just have to be really grounded and realistic and see that a normal viewer who's watching these sports can just see that it simply is a sport. We think there's some viewers who really love sports and really thrive of this sort of competition. They get a lot of benefits from it. But secondly though, they just take away the sort of benefit that we get when a community a little village in Mexico or something is able to see one of their athletes perform at the Olympics, right? This is a really cool benefit, completely mutually exclusive to our side of the house. They also didn't give us a single response to my split point that came out. It's this exclusive power that the Olympic has to pressure something like China to end the genocide, right? This is a really important benefit under our side of the house that was just not sufficiently responded to, because we're able to save millions of Muslims, right, from genocide. Really important. But then finally now, how does this impact athletes? Really important to note here that athletes are not being forced to go and go to the Olympics at all, right? This is a choice that they get to make. So the people that we're actually impacting here really love their sport. They've been looking forward to this for a long time. They really want to train here, and we're able to actually get coverage for these athletes to get sponsors to get money, or we're able to just give them a gold medal around their neck to reward all of their hard work that they've worked for their whole life, right? This is a really important benefit that AF wants to take away from them, simply because some might be stressed. If you're too stressed to go to the Olympics, you probably won't go at all. Incredibly proud to stand and win this clash too.
I'd like to thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the affirmative reply to conclude today's debate.
Down the line, the negating team's case basically hinged on this concept that every government is a completely rational actor, right? They basically told us if they don't have that in their capacity, if it's not in the best long-term interests of their citizens, they're just going to very rationally step forward and say, sorry, nah, can't do it. We hate to break it to them, and it's a bit of a nasty surprise, but not all governments are rational actors, right? And most of them aren't. And we gave you many lines of analysis as to all the massive incentives on them to not look at the long-term development of their own countries and to actually pursue short-term profits. That was not responded to, and that's not good enough for them to come up here and say, oh, we modelled it in. No, because when we gave you multiple mechanisms of how it literally directly contradicts the interests of these countries and of the politicians running these countries, it is not good enough to try and lean on a model that was implemented last minute to try and change our main point that we brought you at first. So what do we say to this? We say we actually give you many mechanisms compelling countries to actually overpromise or actually go into things that they're not ready for, right? We told you that corporate contractors have a direct incentive to encourage extravagant hosting because it literally derives profit for them, right? We said that the Olympics is a perfect pathway for corruption and it facilitates nepotistic infrastructure projects. But also we said that politicians in any country, whether it's developing or developed, are incentivized to prioritize big campaign promises to obtain short-term electoral wins over, thinking of the long-term humanitarian developments for their nations for decades to come, right? So we say even in developing countries, and developed countries, well-off countries, we'd rather money is invested for real social issues, right? Because they had us believe that it's perfectly fine if London or LA or a similar city, spends all these $1 billion poured into all these fun sports games. But when these countries still have massive homelessness, still have massive deprivation and massive poverty, we'd much rather support that on our side of the house. Why is all of this so important? Because on their side of the house, they had to stand down the line for a comparative where the billions of money funneled into Olympics are not put into healthcare, right? They're not put into education, or they're not even put into just basic infrastructure, right? Because they kind of misunderstood actually how this funding is derived, right? Because at third they tried to sneak in this thing that we had already introduced at first, that they tried to say that the Olympics are based on foreign investment, right? No, we told you at first, it's actually primarily based on tax dollars, and it's based on loans taken out on behalf of governments, right? It's something that the governments actually have to take out themselves. It's not something that they just get invested in and, are able to send off to companies. It's something that they have to actually pay for from their own tax dollars, right? So what do we see at the end of this? We see that it's not good enough for them to say that the IOC reviews reports when we've given you so many mechanisms and real-life examples from history, from recent years, where it directly contradicts all of the things they've been saying. Secondly, on this point of nationalism, right? Because they told us that even if nationalism is somewhat influenced by Olympics, it's same with any sports competitions. We told you from very first that Olympics is uniquely tied to nations, right? That's where we've seen such implementation of literal government programs to allow Russian athletes to dope to try and look better on the world stage, right? We said that's a very unique a very unique harm on their side of the house because it's literally specifically tied to nations. They also told us this kind of ridiculous concept that the Olympics has the power to apply things like sanctions. We literally told you at third that there are many other mechanisms with governments do this by diplomacy, coalitions, all these things. But more than that, we think it's just patently ridiculous for them to come out at first and say that the Olympics are really attractive for investment and then say we're going to knock out all the biggest countries that have done human rights abuses, losing out on tons of investment. Direct contradiction in the case that we had already addressed earlier. Also, they told us about this impact on sports, and we just think it's another direct contradiction in the case at the point at which they say all the massive pressures on athletes somehow exist on our side because there will still be sports competitions, but simultaneously, there's no other sports competitions that these athletes can go to, right? Because we think it's very likely that these athletes will be satisfied with, $1 million job rather than Usain Bolt's, $100 million paying career, right? Because not only do they still obtain a level of fame and a level of success, but the primary motivator on these people is actually going to be their passion for the sport. On their side of the house, they never addressed the terrible effects of commercialization and, corporate sponsorships of athletes that basically destroy sport as a whole for all of society. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank all speakers for their speeches, and I invite you guys to cross the floor and shake hands. Well done and a great show.
Thank you. Thank you.